Jack Turner had always been a man of simplicity. His world was one of dirt, sweat, and the rhythmic pulse of the land. On a dusty farm nestled on the outskirts of a small, peaceful colony, he spent his days tending to crops and livestock, his hands calloused and weathered by years of hard labor. He didn't need much in life, just the steady hum of his tractor, the chatter of the birds in the morning, and the warm comfort of a long day's work. It was a routine that had carried him through the years, a routine that kept his mind grounded and his heart at ease. And for Jack, that was enough. The rest of the universe, wars, politics, and all the chaos of the far-off cities, was just noise. Noise that didn't reach him in his quiet corner of the galaxy. Until the sky changed. It was subtle at first, a faint shimmer in the atmosphere that Jack couldn't quite place. He dismissed it as a trick of the heat. The sun was always fierce this time of year. But as the hours passed, that shimmer deepened, and the air grew strangely thick, like something unseen was pressing down on the very air around him. He wiped the sweat from his brow and stood still, eyes scanning the horizon. And then the ground trembled. At first, it was a mere vibration, like a distant truck passing over the farthest hills. But soon it escalated, the tremors growing sharper and more pronounced. Jack's gut tightened, his senses alert as the soil beneath his feet seemed to thrum with an unnatural force. His heart skipped a beat when he saw it, distant at first, but unmistakable, a massive shadow, stretching across the sky, slowly creeping closer. A ship. No, not just a ship, an armada. The shapes of countless vessels, dark and angular, moved across the sky in perfect formation, blocking out the sun in ominous waves. His eyes widened in disbelief. This was no ordinary arrival. These ships were unlike anything he had ever seen. Their edges were sharp, their surfaces smooth and metallic, reflecting the light in strange patterns. They were massive, their scale incomprehensible. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Panic began to rise within him as he turned toward the house. He had to get to the communications terminal. Maybe it was a military drill. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe. The sudden roar of energy interrupted his thoughts. A bolt of blue lightning tore through the sky, striking the ground 100 meters from his field. The force of the blast sent a shockwave that knocked Jack off his feet, his body crashing into the dirt. He groaned as he pushed himself up, dizzy and shaken, his ears ringing with a loud, hollow sound. Through the haze of dust and confusion, Jack spotted a group of figures emerging from one of the ships. They were tall, their movements deliberate and fluid, their silhouettes outlined by the blazing light of the ship's engines. They wore armor that gleamed unnaturally, and their eyes, those eyes, were the deepest shade of black he had ever seen. The air around them seemed to shimmer, warping as though reality itself was bending under their presence. Jack's mind raced. There was no mistake. The aliens had arrived. But why? This wasn't a colony of strategic importance. There were no military assets here, no advanced technology, just farms and quiet lives. His heart hammered in his chest as he stumbled to his feet, his mind scrambling for answers. The figures moved with purpose, heading toward the center of the colony. He could hear shouts, cries of panic, the unmistakable sounds of a world being torn apart. Jack turned toward the fields, a fleeting thought crossing his mind. His wife and daughter were still in the house. But could he make it back in time? The fear that gripped his chest was overwhelming. What could a simple farmer do against a force like this? His eyes narrowed. No, he wouldn't wait to be swept up in their chaos. He had no military training, no weapons, no plans. But he had something else. Something deeper. Something primal that had been buried in the quiet of his life. Survival. With a newfound resolve, Jack sprinted toward the barn, his boots pounding against the dirt. He needed something. Anything. The aliens may have the upper hand in technology, but he knew this land better than anyone. And he would use that to his advantage. As he reached the barn door and yanked it open, he could already hear the distant sounds of gunfire. The battle had begun. But for Jack Turner, it was only the beginning of something far larger. Something that would turn his quiet life upside down. But he wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a man with a purpose. A man who would fight back. And he would start by making his farm his battleground. Jack slammed the barn door shut behind him, the echo of its heavy thud vibrating through the walls. His heart raced, but his mind was sharp. There was no time to waste. He scanned the dimly lit interior, searching for anything that could help him. His eyes fell on the long, rusted tools hanging from a wall, plows, sickles, and the like. Nothing particularly useful for defending against an alien invasion. But then his gaze settled on something else. A sturdy rifle, its stock worn from years of use. He'd kept it for hunting, something his father had passed down to him, but never thought he'd need it for anything like this. Jack grabbed it without hesitation, quickly checking the chamber. Loaded. Good. He didn't know much about fighting, but he did know how to survive in the wilderness. He knew how to track, how to move silently, and how to make the most of what the land offered. This would be his new battleground. His fingers tightened around the rifle as he stepped back outside. The heat of the day had turned to a strange chill, the air humming with a palpable tension. The alien ships hovered like dark vultures in the sky, their sheer size making them seem as though they were always present, always watching. A voice crackled in the air, distorted by static. It was coming from the communications terminal near the farmhouse. This is not a drill. Evacuate immediately. The voice was abruptly cut off, followed by more static. Jack's blood ran cold. The military didn't even have time to respond. Whoever or whatever was coming wasn't here for peace. He clenched his jaw, moving cautiously toward the farmhouse. Every step he took was deliberate, careful. He wasn't a soldier, but he was a man who had lived through droughts, storms, and the grinding labor of farming. He knew how to survive, how to endure. This was no different. As he crept around the edge of the field, he spotted a few of the alien soldiers, their armor reflecting the strange, metallic glow of their ships. They were moving with precision, methodical, like predators on the hunt. Their black eyes scanned the horizon, seemingly indifferent to the destruction they were causing. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. His thoughts raced. How could he fight these creatures? What could he do against an invader that had already proven its power? His mind flickered back to his family, his wife Mary and daughter Emily. They were inside the house, and he couldn't leave them behind. But the aliens were close, too close. He knew that he had to act, and act fast. Moving toward the farmhouse's side, Jack peered around the corner, his heart pounding in his chest. The first alien soldier was almost within range, its sleek armor glinting as it scanned the area. Jack's pulse quickened. He'd never shot a living target before. But this wasn't the time to hesitate. He took a deep breath and aimed carefully. A single shot rang out, loud and sharp in the still air. The alien collapsed, a clean shot to the chest. It fell to the ground with a heavy thud, its weapon clattering beside it. Jack's heart was in his throat. He didn't have time to savor the victory. The others would have heard the shot. He could see them now, turning toward the source of the noise, their dark eyes narrowing as they began to move toward him. He ducked back behind the corner, heart hammering in his chest. There was no way he could take on all of them. He was just one man, after all. But he'd bought himself a few seconds. That was all he needed. He sprinted toward the front door, rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning for any movement. When he reached the porch, he hesitated. Inside, his wife and daughter would be waiting, likely terrified. Would they be safe if he took them with him? Or would they become a burden? Jack's mind raced. He needed a plan, and fast. As he turned the knob and pushed the door open, he heard a faint sound from inside. Mary's voice. "Jack, is that you?" "Get down," he shouted, rushing inside. Mary turned to him in a flash, her face pale with fear. "What's happening? What's going on?" "There's no time. We have to go now." He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back door, when a sudden explosion rocked the house. The walls shuddered, and dust rained from the ceiling. The alien soldiers had found them. Jack's instincts kicked in. He shoved Mary and Emily toward the kitchen, grabbing the rifle from the table. His mind raced. The window there. The barn was still his best option. He could make it there. But he had to buy them time. Turning toward the front door, Jack fired another shot, sending one of the soldiers stumbling back. He took a deep breath and gave a quick glance back to his family. "Stay here and don't make a sound," he told them. He couldn't afford to hesitate now. The aliens were on his doorstep. But Jack wasn't going to wait to be overwhelmed. This was his land, and he'd be damned if he let anyone, alien or otherwise, take it from him without a fight. The dust settled, but Jack's heart still thundered in his chest. His rifle felt heavy in his hands, but it was a weight he was willing to bear. The kitchen door slammed behind him as he crouched by the corner, waiting for the next move. The loud crackle of alien voices filtered in through the chaos, their language garbled but unmistakably hostile. The thud of their boots on the ground was like a countdown ticking down to their next strike. Through the crack in the door, Jack could see them. More of the armored soldiers had moved in, fanning out through the front yard. Their faces, if you could even call them faces, were obscured by helmets, but their movements betrayed an almost surgical precision, as if they were well trained in hunting prey. And Jack? He was their prey. But not today. He looked over his shoulder, ensuring Mary and Emily were still hidden safely in the kitchen. Emily had her hands over her ears, and Mary was trying her best to calm her, but fear was in her eyes. Jack didn't have the luxury of reassuring them. He had to act. They didn't have much time. The barn. That's where he had to go. But getting there would be harder than he'd hoped. Jack darted from his position and moved swiftly through the yard, keeping low, his rifle aimed forward as his eyes flicked nervously over every patch of shadow. He knew the terrain better than anyone, but the aliens were methodical. They'd already cornered off the area around the house, their ships hovering ominously overhead, their engines humming like the ominous drone of a hunting beast. He ducked behind a shed, his mind racing for a plan. If he could reach the barn, he might be able to turn the tables. There were tools in there, old, reliable farm equipment that had seen more than a few battles with the land over the years. Maybe one of them could help him stand a fighting chance. The barn was small, but it was hidden behind a rise in the earth. If he moved fast, he might still be able to get there without being spotted. Jack checked his rifle's chamber again. Full. It was all he had. He took a breath and bolted for the back of the barn, moving as silently as he could. His boots kicked up the dirt, and every step seemed to send his heart into his throat. He had to get to cover, had to find something to use. And then just as he reached the barn's rear door, a sound that made his blood freeze echoed through the yard. The alien soldiers were close, too close. Jack spun, instinctively raising the rifle, but before he could fire, a blur of movement appeared in his peripheral vision. One of the aliens, its armor gleaming darkly in the fading sunlight, rounded the corner, spotting him. Jack fired without thinking, the blast echoing off the barn walls. The shot went wide, missing its mark by inches, but the soldier's speed was unnerving. It twisted and leaped, narrowly avoiding the bullet. But Jack had already anticipated its next move. He slammed his shoulder into the barn door, knocking it wide open, and darted inside. For a brief moment, he felt like he had gained the upper hand. But then, the ground shook again. A sound like thunder reverberated through the air, and Jack felt the walls of the barn tremble. The alien ships overhead began to move, low and slow, their engines roaring to life. His heart sank as he saw it. The largest of the ships, a massive behemoth, began to descend toward the earth, its shadow looming over everything. The soldiers outside were gathering around it, pulling something from the ship's belly. A device. Jack's mind spun. They were setting up for something, preparing for a larger assault. This wasn't just a raid. This was an invasion. He had no time to waste. The barn was no longer safe. They were going to burn the whole place down if they had to. His eyes scanned the barn quickly. His father's old plow sat in the corner, a rusty relic of a bygone era. A small generator hummed in the far corner, still hooked up to the main circuit of the farm. That's when it hit him. He didn't need to fight them head-on. He needed to outsmart them. Jack grabbed the plow and dragged it to the center of the barn. He used its sharp edge to wedge it under a stack of old hay bales, propping them up precariously. Then, moving quickly, he turned the generator on and pulled out the thick cables. He wrapped the wires around the supports of the barn, rigging it like an old trap. The electricity from the generator would send a surge through the barn's internal wiring, enough to create a short circuit that would disrupt the alien tech just long enough for him to make his escape. His hands were shaking, but he focused all his energy on the task. The noise from the soldiers outside grew louder, but he couldn't afford to think about them. He connected the wires, checked the setup, and then sprinted toward the back door. He didn't have much time before the aliens would be all over the place. Suddenly, an explosion shook the barn, throwing him off balance. The air grew thick with smoke and debris. The aliens had made their move. Jack dove into the dirt as another explosion rocked the barn, and the whole structure groaned as if it might collapse at any second. The alien soldiers were advancing, but Jack wasn't waiting for them to get any closer. He hit the switch. The barn erupted in a surge of blinding light as the generator powered up. Sparks flew as the cable sparked, sending a jolt of electricity through the barn's wiring, setting off a chain reaction. The shock wave slammed into the alien tech just outside, and Jack heard the unmistakable hiss of alien equipment malfunctioning. He didn't look back as he sprinted for the farmhouse, but in the corner of his eye, he saw the alien soldiers retreating, their systems flickering erratically. They weren't used to human ingenuity, and it had given Jack the one thing he needed: time. And in that time, he was going to fight back. Jack didn't stop running. The shock wave from the barn had thrown the alien soldiers into disarray, but it wouldn't hold them off for long. They were resilient, and Jack knew they would regroup quickly. He had bought them some time, but just a few precious seconds. The farmhouse was only a short distance away, but it felt like miles. The ground trembled beneath his feet as he sprinted across the yard, his lungs burning from exertion. He could still hear the distant whine of alien engines and the low hum of their ships as they began to hover once more. But this time, Jack didn't feel the crushing weight of fear that had gripped him earlier. No. Now there was something else inside him, something that burned hotter than the adrenaline coursing through his veins. It was the fire of defiance. He wasn't going to let these invaders take his world without a fight. He reached the farmhouse door in a blur of motion and kicked it open with a force that sent it crashing against the wall. Inside, Mary and Emily were huddled in the kitchen, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. The air was thick with tension, but Jack could see the slight flicker of hope in Mary's eyes when she saw him. "Jack, what happened?" Mary rushed to his side, grabbing his arm as though she couldn't believe he was back. "We don't have much time," Jack said, his voice low and urgent. "The barn's rigged, but we have to move now. The aliens won't be distracted for long." Mary nodded, her face set in grim determination. "What's the plan?" He glanced over at Emily, who clung to her mother, still trembling. Jack's heart ached. He wished he could give them something more than fear and uncertainty, but right now, all he had was his resolve. He had to turn this around. For them. For his farm. For everything they had worked for. The farm's too exposed. "We need to move to the woods. If we can get to the old shelter in the eastern woods, we might have a fighting chance." "How long do we have?" Mary asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not long," Jack replied, pulling her close. "But we'll fight as long as we can." They gathered what little supplies they could carry, just a few essentials: water, food, and a few weapons Jack had tucked away over the years. He grabbed the old hunting knives, a flare gun, and a few extra rounds of ammunition. He had no illusions about the odds. They were up against a force far superior to anything humanity had ever seen. But they had one thing the aliens didn't: the element of surprise. Outside, the sound of the alien forces regrouping was deafening. Jack could see their silhouettes moving through the smoke, their armor glinting in the dying light. They were preparing for something big. They were closing in. It was now or never. "Let's move," Jack barked, taking the lead. They rushed out the back door and into the field behind the house, ducking low to avoid detection. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the stench of burning debris from the destroyed barn. But it was also the perfect cover for their movement. They moved in silence, keeping their heads down, using the cover of trees and the uneven terrain to stay out of sight. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot, the rustling of the tall grass. Jack's senses were on high alert. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. The alien ships were getting closer. He could feel their presence in the air, the oppressive weight of their technology bearing down on the land. The ships were silent now, hovering ominously above the ground as they waited for their prey to make a mistake. But Jack wasn't going to make one. Not if he could help it. They reached the edge of the woods and ducked into the dense underbrush, their movements slower now, more deliberate. Jack motioned for them to keep quiet. There was no telling how advanced the alien sensors were, but it was clear they could hear even the smallest of sounds. They had made it to the shelter in the woods, an old, forgotten structure that Jack's father had built long ago. It had once been a storm shelter, a safe haven from the harsh seasons and the wild storms that often tore through the region. Now, it would serve as their last refuge. Inside, Jack quickly barricaded the door. The small, windowless space was dark and cramped, but it would have to do. They couldn't stay here forever, but for now, it was the only safe place. "Are we safe?" Emily's voice broke the silence, her eyes wide with terror. Jack knelt down in front of her, his heart aching. "For now, sweetheart. We're safe for now." Mary stood by the entrance, her face set, her eyes scanning the dark space. She looked like a woman who had seen too much in too little time. "What do we do next?" Jack didn't hesitate. "We fight back. The aliens are used to overwhelming their enemies. They're not expecting a resistance. We have to make them pay for every inch of ground they take." "But Jack," Mary began, her voice faltering. "We'll figure out," he said, cutting her off. "We have the land, we have the knowledge of the terrain, and we have each other. That's enough." He looked around at the shelter, the walls, the old tools, the weapons they had salvaged, and a plan began to form in his mind. They could build something. They could set traps, use the land to their advantage. The aliens may have superior firepower, but Jack had something they didn't: the ability to blend with the environment, to move unnoticed, to strike when they least expected it. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was a fight, and Jack Turner wasn't about to lose. The shelter's low, narrow walls kept the outside world at bay, but Jack knew that peace was fleeting. The alien forces were methodical, relentless in their pursuit, and it was only a matter of time before they found the shelter. He had seen enough to know that these invaders were not to be underestimated. They wouldn't stop until every last human was either eradicated or subjugated. But Jack wasn't going down without a fight. And as he sat in the dim light of the shelter, a sense of urgency filled him. He couldn't wait for the military to come to the rescue, for some hero to swoop in and save the day. He had his family to protect. He had his land to protect. And he had a plan. Mary had begun to prepare a small meal with the supplies they had brought, but Jack barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, already mapping out the terrain in his head. The woods surrounding the shelter were thick, but there were trails. Trails that led to other places: the hills, the creek, the old mill. If he could draw the aliens out into the woods, into the open where their technology would be hindered, he could start to turn the tide. But it would take careful planning. He would need to create distractions, set up traps, use the environment to his advantage. His thoughts turned to his old hunting equipment. He could use the snares, the tripwires. And the flare gun? It could be used to signal their position, to lead the aliens into a false trap. "Jack." Mary's voice broke his focus. She was standing at the entrance, her eyes shadowed with worry. "Yeah," he replied, looking up. "Are you sure this is the right move? I mean, what are we really up against? They're not just some raiders. They're something else." He stood, walking over to her and taking her hands in his. Her fingers were cold, trembling ever so slightly. "I know what they are," he said softly. "But I also know they've made one mistake, They underestimated us. They think they can sweep through here like we're nothing. But we're not nothing. And we're not going down easy. Mary didn't argue. She nodded, though the worry still creased her brow. Okay, but how do we even begin to fight them? We can't take them head on. They've got weapons we can't even imagine. Jack exhaled slowly, trying to push aside the doubt that crept into his own mind. We don't need to fight them head on. We just need to make them work for it. We're not soldiers, but we're farmers. We know how to make things grow and how to make them die. The land's our ally. Mary looked at him, a flicker of hope sparking in her eyes. So, you're saying we turn the land into our weapon? Jack gave a small, grim smile. Exactly. For the next few hours, they worked together, preparing what they could from the supplies they had left. They rigged up traps in the woods, carefully laying snares, tripwires, and makeshift explosives that would detonate on impact. Jack knew that a single mistake could cost them everything, so he worked quickly but precisely. There was no room for error. Emily stayed in the shelter, her wide eyes occasionally peeking out from behind the entrance, watching her parents work. Jack could see the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else. It was the same spark of resilience he'd seen in himself when the aliens first arrived. Emily was scared, but she was strong. By nightfall, the traps were set, and Jack felt a slight flicker of hope. They were still far from safe, but this was a beginning. The aliens wouldn't know what hit them. Then, as the darkness of night settled over the woods, they heard it. Footsteps, muffled at first, but growing louder. Jack held his breath, motioning for Mary and Emily to stay low. His heart pounded in his chest as he crouched near the shelter's entrance, peering through the cracks. The alien forces had arrived. They were advancing through the woods, their movements precise, but Jack could tell they were on high alert. They were looking for something, anything that would lead them to the humans. His pulse quickened. This was it, the first test of their defenses. Stay quiet, Jack whispered. Let them get closer. The sound of alien boots grew louder as they approached, but Jack didn't move. He kept his focus on the path leading into the woods, where he'd set the first trap. The air seemed to thrum with tension. Suddenly, a series of low clicks echoed through the night, the sound of one of the aliens triggering a tripwire. The trap had been set. In an instant, the silence shattered with the roar of an explosion. The blast was small, but powerful enough to send a shockwave through the woods. The alien soldier caught in the trap was thrown back, his armor twisting under the force of the blast. A few of his comrades scattered, disoriented, but others remained, scanning the area, trying to pinpoint the source of the attack. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he fired the flare gun into the sky, the bright light streaking across the darkened woods. The aliens froze, momentarily distracted by the sudden burst of light. That was the moment Jack had been waiting for. "Move," he hissed, signaling to Mary and Emily. They ran silently into the woods, their path concealed by the smoke and confusion caused by the explosion. Jack led them through the trees, moving quickly but carefully, as the sound of alien voices rose in a chaotic frenzy behind them. The aliens had underestimated them, but now they were engaged in a fight they hadn't planned for. Now, they had to reckon with the fact that humans weren't just easy prey. They were more dangerous than the invaders could ever imagine. The woods were thick with smoke, the air stinging with the acrid scent of burning debris and the sharp crackle of distant explosions. Jack's heart raced as he led Mary and Emily through the underbrush, the sound of alien shouts and weapons fire echoing behind them. The flare had drawn the aliens into the trap, but it hadn't finished them off. They were regrouping quickly, adapting to the ambush, and Jack knew time was running out. "Keep moving," he hissed, urging his family forward. They had to make it to the creek, a narrow stream that ran through the woods, where the alien sensors would be less effective. There, they could regroup and figure out their next move. The trio moved swiftly, using the terrain to their advantage, the trees providing cover as they slipped deeper into the woods. But Jack knew it wouldn't be long before the aliens would recover and start closing in. They couldn't outrun them forever. Jack had one last trick up his sleeve. The creek wasn't just a natural hiding spot. It was also a way to lure the aliens into another trap. The water was deep enough to slow their movements, making them vulnerable to the next phase of his plan. "We're almost there," Jack whispered, glancing back toward the clearing where the explosions had rocked the night. The alien soldiers were still combing the woods, their voices low but growing more agitated by the second. Suddenly, the crackling of radio chatter echoed through the woods, alien communication, too loud and distorted to make out, but it told Jack everything he needed to know. They were coordinating their search, and they were closing in on the creek. The enemy was relentless. Jack slowed, motioning for Mary and Emily to crouch low. He had to buy them more time. There was no way he could take on the entire alien force in the open, but there was a way to even the odds. A deadly game of cat and mouse was about to unfold, and Jack was determined to make the first strike count. He crouched near a large rock, lifting the flare gun again, this time aiming it toward a distant cluster of trees beyond the creek. The flare shot up into the sky, a bright red streak illuminating the entire area. For a moment, there was silence. Then, as if triggered by the flare, the alien soldiers began to move, drawn toward the signal. "Now," Jack muttered, pulling Emily and Mary down behind the rocks. "We moved to the creek fast." The creek was just ahead, and Jack was already preparing the final pieces of his trap. He had set the creek up in such a way that it would force the aliens into a narrow, open area. When they took the bait and ventured in, they would be met with the second phase of his plan, a wall of fire. Jack and his family crossed the creek as quietly as possible, slipping into the shadows of the opposite bank. The air was thick with the sounds of approaching alien forces. Jack's hands shook, but it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was anticipation. The first phase had worked, and now the aliens were walking into the second phase of the trap. The creek was narrow and winding, perfect for what he needed. It would force the alien soldiers into a funnel, where they would be exposed and vulnerable. He pulled the last piece of his trap from the bag, a small detonator linked to a series of carefully placed charges. His fingers moved quickly, setting the detonator in place and connecting the wires. "Jack, we don't have much time," Mary said, her voice a hushed whisper. She glanced around nervously, but Jack could see the steel in her eyes. She was ready for this. They all were. "I know," Jack muttered. His hand hovered over the detonator. The first alien soldier appeared at the edge of the creek, moving cautiously, its weapons raised. The others were close behind, advancing into the narrow channel as planned. Jack's pulse thudded in his chest. They were close. Too close. He hit the detonator. The explosion was deafening, a thunderous roar that echoed through the woods, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. The aliens had barely a chance to react before the charges exploded around them, sending a cascade of fire and debris into the air. The narrow passage they had walked into became a deadly inferno, flames licking the trees as the aliens' technology flickered and sputtered under the blast. For a moment, everything was chaos. The alien soldiers screamed, their communication devices sparking with static, their movements erratic. The fire, thick and unrelenting, caught the trees nearby, sending burning embers flying into the night sky. The explosion had devastated the aliens' first wave, but Jack knew the battle wasn't over. "They're regrouping," Jack shouted, pulling his family deeper into the woods. He could hear the alien cries from the flames. They weren't retreating. They were preparing for a counterattack. Jack knew that the real fight had only just begun. But now, there was something different in the air. The aliens had underestimated the power of human resilience, the resourcefulness that came from years of struggle and survival. The fight wasn't just for his land anymore. It was a fight for his people, his planet. The aliens had thought they were dealing with prey, but they were wrong. As Jack led Mary and Emily further into the trees, he heard the whine of alien engines overhead. The invasion was far from over, but now Jack had something they didn't: the confidence that, with his family at his side, he could turn this war around. It wasn't over. It was just beginning.